Hello, welcome to Australia Unshackled. Today is the 6th of April and it's Tuesday. And my name's Catherine and this is Glenn Isherwood. And today we are joined by a special guest, Robert Barwick. Hello.
Hi, Kat.
And he's the CEC National Executive Member and Veteran Researcher of the Citizens Electoral Council. And he's going to be giving an introduction and a report into the Inter-Alpha Group of Australia and the operations that have been happening with the British Empire operations in Australia. But before we get to that, Glenn's just going to introduce how we got to this to begin with, starting with what Lyndon LaRouche exposed a few weeks ago.
Right, you have right now, in just the last few weeks, Lyndon LaRouche came out in his last webcast, the Ides of March webcast, and declared that he is right now devoted and dedicated to destroying the dirty hand of the British Empire, which is this global inter-alpha group associated with the Rothschild British banking interests. And what LaRouche pretty much identified was that this inter-alpha group has been for many decades a looting operation on nation states. And LaRouche singled out Brazil and the operations being run in Brazil with the carry trade, where this global grouping of banks, typified by Banco Santander in Spain and also others like the Royal Bank of Scotland, and these groups were using the Brazilian carry trade to loot the nation to make a killing, quite literally. And Lyndon LaRouche declared that this is what he is out to destroy, this British Empire-based system of looting. And we here in Australia have had quite a bit of, the Citizens Electoral Council has done quite a bit of work over the years to investigate how this international arm of the British banking interests has been looting Australia and using Australia much like they are with Brazil. So, Robert, do you want to let us know what you've been uncovering under these in your research lately on this?
Well, this is research that we've been doing over 15 years because the Australian operations of the Inter-Alpha Group have centred on a specialised form of looting known as privatisation, which Australians nowadays hate because they've seen what it does, but it's still ongoing. And from the whole history of privatisation in Australia has been one of a looting of our nation state directed by this very same Inter-Alpha Group. And in fact, there's a certain amount of what we know about the international operations of the Inter-Alpha Group that we found out from our research here, right? So just to go back to the beginning of it, from the very late years of the 1980s onwards, under the economic revolution of Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, they'd done a whole transformation of our economy, deregulated the banking system, floated the Australian dollar, those types of things, cut tariffs, right? Started destroying our industries through cheap imports coming in. The next step that they did was privatisation, and they put big assets like Qantas and the Commonwealth
And they
Bank.
made it sound so appealing.
Oh, of course.
That people wouldn't actually say no.
Well, they say things like, they used to use certain arguments like, one, you can have a user pays system. Instead of the taxpayers supporting these assets, they can be run at a profit, right? And of course, private business always runs things better than governments do. Everyone knows that. That's just an absolute fact, right? Everyone from all the great examples prove that, like Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns and all the rest of them. AIG. Private business is brilliant. So they used to use these arguments, right? So we've got to get them off our book. Get private business involved in running these assets. Qantas was the first cab off the rank, and with assets like Qantas, they make arguments that the money that the government makes from selling Qantas, it can put to better use elsewhere. Because they would say, we can use that money for services, important ones like hospitals and schools, and for infrastructure, right?
Has that money gone into the hospitals and schools?
Well, if we're talking to an Australian audience, they can answer that for themselves, right? Because what's happened in the 20 years since this has been ongoing, what is the nature of it, state of our hospitals and schools, etc.? Of course not, it's a joke. It's an absolute joke. I'm going to give you some details of that. I just want to paint a bit of a picture. You had the first big assets they sold were Qantas and the Commonwealth Bank, right? They sold all the Qantas to British Airways. They sold the Commonwealth, a third of the Commonwealth Bank.
And this was by the same Labor Party that actually founded the National Bank.
That's right.
For the intention of building up Australia's industry, building up its manufacturing.
This was our People's Bank.
So
right?
The same party, many decades on, turns around and says, no, well, now we're committed to competition and privatisation. As Paul Keating said, little government, not big government anymore.
And they had a peculiar argument too with the Commonwealth Bank, which was that by privatising it and floating it on the stock exchange, Australian people would be able to buy it. Whereas, of course, Australian people already owned it. It was our bank.
Exactly.
It was the People's Bank, right? So this was the type of things they did. Just in terms of the Commonwealth Bank, just as an example, in the years while the Commonwealth Bank was in existence and owned by the government, they were the days when you had a lot of bank branches around Australia, right? You had banks made profits, of course, but their profits was in the tens and into the early hundreds of millions of dollars. Once the privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank was finalised in 1996, it was from then on that you saw the biggest explosion in bank profitability that Australia's ever seen. In the decade after that, the big four banks, which included the private Commonwealth Bank, had profits of about $60 billion in a decade. They shut thousands of branches around Australia. They laid off thousands of bank tellers, tens of thousands of bank tellers.
Yeah, this is what they do. They make a profit and they shut everything down in the meantime.
Exactly, it's cannibalism, right? They cannibalise their profits.
So it's not actually based on the development of the country. It's based on how much profit can we make to loot and shut it down.
Well,
the effect is the looting.
Exactly, it's an excellent example of why we use the word looting.
Right.
Because before, when it wasn't privatised, that wasn't possible. And it was also a check on the other private banks, so they couldn't get away with it either.
Because just for people out there, the National Bank, the People's Bank, was actually based around putting money into things that needed to develop the population and develop infrastructure and production. And, right now we're not developing anything.
As a People's Bank, it could provide investment and services in a way that the private banks wouldn't, because they were more interested in their bottom line.
Right, the dollar.
It was still profitable for the Commonwealth Bank to provide these services, but the margin of profit wasn't as high, but it allowed the long-term things to be invested in, like infrastructure, etc. So, and anyone can look at the history of it. Anyone who thinks after you look at all the assets that have been privatised in Australia that it's been good for us, you're a fool. So this started in the very late 1980s, and the first sales took place in 1990 and 1991. And then in 1992, it went to a whole new level, because Geoffrey Gibb Kennett was elected Premier of Victoria. And in the period when he was Premier of Victoria, you saw the most intense privatisation program implemented anywhere in the world. More assets were privatised more quickly than anywhere to date.
Would you say that it was worse or on a scale larger than even the collapsed Soviet Union?
I know nothing's worse than the Soviet Union, and nothing was on that scale. But in the case of Kennett, what it was, most people don't appreciate what happened in the Soviet Union. It was that bad, right? And that's what this our EIR report's about.
Right. Since Lyndon LaRouche came out talking about the Inter-Alpha Group and declaring his intent to bust this thing up and destroy it, you guys out there can find in this copy of the EIR, available from the Citizens Electoral Council, a pretty thorough report going through how this group, the Inter-Alpha Group, looted Russia following its breakup and how that's been done on a worldwide scale. So that report is definitely complements everything we're discussing here.
But the looting of Russia was absolutely extraordinary. It's just that it started around the same time as Victoria and Australia started, right?
So Jeff Kennett, what did he do?
Well, before he was elected in 1992, the program that he implemented was written out for him. And
Right.
it was a document, or a series of documents, titled Project Victoria.
And people would see that, they'd be familiar with that today. There's signs of Project Victoria on the streets, even today.
Well, that's probably their way of gloating.
Yeah.
At the time, nobody outside of a certain circle was aware that this was so planned.
Mm-hmm.
These and you see in the Kennett case how the Rothschild Inter Alpha group operated. I'll just give you the details. The Project Victoria documents were written by, or co-written by, two organisations in Australia. One is called the Tasman Institute and one is called the Institute of Public Affairs. Now, they're both think tanks and they're both fronts for a British think tank called the Mont Pelerin Society. Now, this British think tank we call the British Crown's Economic Warfare Unit, right? Mm-hmm. And this Mont Pelerin Society have directed all the monetarist economic takeovers of the world since World War II, right? They formed at the end of World War II with a bunch of ex-Nazi supporters to do this. Yeah.
As I understand it, was also the financing for setting up the Mont Pelerin Society came from a guy called Harley Drayton. He wasn't a lord, they didn't want to...
That's right. Harley Drayton, the guy who arranged the funding of the Mont Pelerin Society, was the manager of the Queen of England's personal finances. And he's not Lord Harley Drayton or Sir Harley Drayton because he is, someone like him is in such a sensitive position, and they prefer that he doesn't get that much attention. So they wouldn't give him that kind of honour, so he can operate in a sort of a freewheeling way to run these kinds of operations. And the Mont Pelerin Society is one of those, right? And every kind of nation that had become an example for economic reform was like countries like Chile and New Zealand and Australia were all directed by this same gang. Now, these Australian fronts, the think tanks in Australia, were the Tasman Institute and the IPA. In the case of the Tasman Institute, its chairman was Sidney Ballieu Meyer, who was also the chairman of NM Rothschild and Sons. And other people on
Which is the Australian subsidiary of the Rothschild...
He was the chairman of the Australian subsidiary of Rothschild's World Bank, the NM Rothschild and Sons of London, right? He was the chairman of the Australian subsidiary of that. There were other banks involved as well, like the most notorious outside Rothschild's Macquarie Bank. Mm-hmm. They were very heavily involved in financing the Tasman Institute. So they gave Kennett this blueprint for reform, and Kennett implemented it with gusto. It was all kinds of reforms. It was, gutting the hospital system, it was reforming the ports, busting unions, and privatising Victoria's state-owned enterprises, right? And the principal target being our very impressive electricity system.
Why did they want to privatise?
Well, they would say things like, we've got to run it more efficiently. Government shouldn't be involved, those types of arguments. They just made an absolute killing out of this. And we documented this in our New Citizens. Actually, some of it is documented in this publication. People can read that. Stop the British Crown plot to crush Australia's unions. Right, you can see how some of these networks operated, and there's flowcharts, etc. that explain it there. When Kennett sold these assets, for banks like Macquarie Bank and NM Rothschild and Sons, if they weren't earning fees of tens of millions of dollars to arrange the sale of the assets, they were usually involved in organising the financing for the consortiums that bought the assets, right? So they got to write the policies of privatising the assets, and they got to make a killing in the purchasing and the sales of the assets, right? That's the way they operated. And they had a field day. And while Kennett was doing it, and then you had a change of government federally, Howard and Costello came in, and they continued what Hawke and Keating had started federally. You had the biggest privatisation in Australia was the sale of Telstra, right? You had the final sale of the Commonwealth Bank, and the same gang of banks were involved the whole way. Now here's what's interesting about Rothschild and how lucrative this was for them. By 1998, the Harvard professor who's written a sort of like the official history of the Rothschild, Niall Ferguson, who wrote the book The House of Rothschild, he reported that as of 1998, 1/3 of all the profits of NM Rothschild and Sons globally came from Australia.
1/3.
That's
1/3.
huge.
That is enormous, because this is an enormous world bank. It's one of the oldest banks. In fact, it's called the World Banker. It's one of the oldest banks. It's fingers in
out
every
of what
pie.
countries was that? A lot of countries?
Well, the Rothschilds would have interests everywhere, right?
And Australia is only a small country.
We're a big piece of land.
Right.
We're a tiny economy, really.
Yeah.
You know,
In
relatively.
comparison.
Sure. So they're having an absolute field day here, right?
Huge.
Is that just from the privatisations, or is it?
No, there's two. The privatisations largely, but the other area of interest of the Rothschilds, which is not as well known, and especially in Australia, is they have extensive interest in resources. And of course, resources is the number one way Australia is still being looted to this day. Every time we export raw materials, right, we are robbing ourselves.
Which is why we're actually saying nationalise the
Exactly.
raw materials.
So we know, for example, that through one fund alone of Lord Jacob Rothschild in London today, one fund, the St James Place Investment Fund, that one fund owns 3% of Rio Tinto. Well, Rio Tinto is a huge global conglomerate, right? A 3% stake is very, very significant. And they would have a lot more than that. That's just one example that we know. So they've got a lot of fingers in the resource pie as well. But the two together, resources and privatisations, they were, laughing all the way to the bank, because it was their own bank as well.
Oh.
Now, since then, what's interesting is how things have developed politically, because, in the CEC we were leading the fight against this, exposing it, etc. A lot of people instinctively, we saw over the years, most Australians never really bought the argument for privatisation, frankly, but that didn't matter.
They just got it shoved down their
Exactly.
throat.
The population, the opinions of the population never mattered. Labor and Liberal, collaborated on this to ram these things through.
As you were just saying, that the policies that Keating and Hawke had introduced,
Yep.
which actually came from a document that was a Liberal Party document in the 70s called the Campbell Report, was rewritten, and Hawke even says this himself, was rewritten to become a Labor Party policy, and then continued under Howard and Peter Costello.
Yep.
And now we have Rudd today, who's declared that protectionism and these policies are intrinsically evil.
There would be a lot of people out there thinking, well, what's so bad about privatisation, and what's so bad about not having protectionism? What are the effects? What's so significant about the Inter Alpha Group and Rothschild owning, a third of the privatisation, or a third of their
let's take one example.
profits from Australia?
Just take the example of the electricity system of Victoria, right? We worked with our dear friend who recently died, Lance Endersby. We got to know Lance around the opposition to that privatisation. Lance's opposition was less the financial side and more the physical side. He was an engineer. He warned that if you take this statewide electricity system, which is finely tuned, where all the different substations and the different control rooms, etc., around the state to provide to make sure electricity gets from where it's being produced to where it's got to go. They coordinate things with each other, because this is all finely engineered. He said if you break those up into different entities that then have to compete with each other, right? You're putting the physical function of the system at risk, And then, of course, the other aspect is you're also imposing a profit motive, which by definition is money that gets taken out of the system. It's money the system generates that gets taken out that previously would stay in the system as part of maintenance, right? Now, you know the Latrobe Valley. Mm-hmm. In 1989, there was something like 20,000 electricity system workers at the Latrobe Valley, right? Within a few years, that had been reduced to less than 5,000. 5,000
people working there.
There used to be 20,000, then 5,000.
That's a dramatic cut.
Yes. What were those people doing before?
When we were doing some work with the local councils in that region, they specifically were saying this was an absolute decimation of that whole region.
Gutted it.
Like the governments couldn't function, provide services. They were still picking themselves off the ground, and this was 2008.
So we're supposed to believe that those people that were laid off were just twiddling their thumbs before that. No, they weren't. They were involved in maintenance, and they were also represented built-in capacity, right? Once upon a time, disasters were preempted because you had a certain capacity to respond to disasters that you didn't know would happen but could happen, right? You had staff there that were able to do those types of things. That didn't fit in with this kind of monetarist arrangement. Now, so there's been problems ever since. Every summer, without fail, we have waves of rolling blackouts and brownouts in Melbourne.
It's a normal thing to happen.
We have to. We're basically ordered to get used to it. Mm-hmm. You know, last summer, this summer was fairly mild. Previous summer was a lot worse. As many people died in the heat wave in Melbourne because of the blackouts, where their air conditioning went off, as died in the bushfires. Right. Elderly people, etc.
It's not something that's really mentioned that loudly in the media, is it?
No, of course not. But then there's another aspect, because it's a good question you asked, Kat. There's another aspect that I think is just hilarious. Kennett's argument for selling the electricity system was to reduce debt. Labor left us this terrible debt, we've got to reduce it.
Right.
And the electricity system basically brought in something like $30 billion, right? It sold for $30 billion, all the different power stations, etc. And they got to write it off our debt, so that was great. However, the companies, the consortiums, the consortia, technical use of proper term, that bought the assets, they all had to borrow heavily. The debt went on them, right? These private, what all it did, what I'm trying to say is all the privatisation did was transfer the debt that was on the government onto the private sector. But this private sector...
Then they cut.
Well, exactly. This became also the excuse to cut, because these private investors are not just trying to service their profit, they have to service that debt, right? And now it's at crisis point. A lot of these power station operators in the Latrobe Valley, they are on edge when it comes to their debt. They're on the verge of default in some cases, right, because they can't pay it. So who are we kidding? We think we became debt-free out of this? No. All it did was a bookkeeping entry go off the government onto the private sector, and for some of these private operators, they are foreshadowing that if they can't get out of this, the only thing they will be able to do is shut down the power stations and leave them. Well, Victoria can't afford that, right? That's nuts. Whereas if it was still with the government, even if it had all that debt, no government would make a decision to shut down those power stations, right?
Because it's not based on a profit orientation.
Exactly. So this is, that's one example, and name me any privatisation you like, we can, deal with it that way.
Well, so let's come back to the question of the inter-alpha group's role under Kennett. How's it shaped up to today? What's going on today?
Well, I think it's instructive to just go back to the beginning of inter-alpha group, just to, because you've got to understand the psychology of what you're dealing with. And the psychology is basically like a swarm of locusts. The Rothschild Bank formed the inter-alpha group in 1971. Now, that was no accident. They couldn't have existed before 1971. Why? Because before 1971 you had the Bretton Woods system. The world financial arrangements were regulated through Bretton Woods. It wasn't perfect, but they were regulated. It was Rothschild and Co. through their assets like George Shultz, the Chicago University guy who got Nixon to destroy the Bretton Woods system. They knew,
that was by floating the
dollar,
the US dollar, making currencies
floating the dollar,
for speculation
and
stuff.
it became that became the beginning of global deregulation.
Mm-hmm.
They formed themselves precisely to take advantage of that, right? So they could, and be a collective group, a gang of banks. I don't call them a group; they're a gang. As a collective, have a financial muscle greater than most governments, frankly, right? And then they were able to go around as this swarm of locusts around the world, looting at will. And as country after country implemented their own reforms, right, floated their own dollars like we did and all that, then they could just come in and swarm and start taking over this way. So that's the way it operated. And in the name of in the privatisation field, this started for them in the late 80s, like I said. By the late 90s, though, there was another phenomenon had entered into the picture, which was the public was sick of this. This was crap, right? That's why I said I'm very confident most Australians would hate privatisation.
Well, we already saw an example of that in New South Wales with how Morrissey Emma wanted to privatise the electricity grid, and what happened was there was a revolt inside the Labor Party membership.
Because he was going to go ahead with it anyway.
And the revolt...
And they kicked him out.
Well, the revolt inside the Labor Party membership reflected the revolt in the community, right?
Yeah, of course.
So here's the Emma thinking he can do what governments had got away with for 20 years, right? And all of a sudden it blew up in his face and cost him his job. That, to me, is a sign of the early signs of what we call the mass strike in Australia. Another example was John Howard wanted to sell the Snowy Mountain scheme, right? And the Snowy Mountain scheme is an icon in Australia. And he had
It's one of the only real huge infrastructure projects that we've actually had in the country, which we need more of.
Exactly. And now the Snowy Mountain scheme is almost, like the debt that was incurred in building it has been paid off, etc. And it's a very profitable operation.
Very reliable.
Howard had the agreement of Victoria and New South Wales, the other stakeholders in the Snowy, so it could all go ahead. But the public outcry was so big that Howard wasn't silly, he backed away. So this is quite significant, but it hasn't gone away, and the one place that it's being pushed today is Queensland. And it's really curious why. The public outcry in Queensland is just as strong, if not stronger. It's just that in Anna Bligh, you have a curious mindset, which really reminds me of Barack Obama. You can tell in the way she makes her public statements about this, she is convinced, or she has been convinced, that what she is doing in this area is right. And so to her, it doesn't matter what opposition she gets. She's going to plough ahead with it regardless.
So this similarity to Obama is this psychology of narcissism, this narrow complex where I'm above the people.
I'm above the people.
My policy is the best for everyone. It's above question. That type of
no,
thinking.
Exactly. And that's why it's no mistake she's known as Captain Bligh. Because for those watching this who don't know history, look it up. Watch Mutiny on the Bounty. Captain Bligh, in that, was a real person who was completely out of touch with the crew on his ship, right? Absolutely out of touch with them, and could not believe that they would even think about mutiny, let alone do it. And so he ended up paying for that. Well, mutiny is where it's a term usually shipping. It's where the people who serve under you rise up and say, okay, you're out of here.
Oh, right.
Right, and they replace you with one of them.
Like
And it was a hangable offence in those days. But it's what the story, and it's a true story. Captain Bligh, after that, came to Australia and was one of our early governors.
So Robert, what's the solution to all of this?
Well, first of all, what Australians, if you hate it, which most people do, right? If you're an Australian citizen, you hate this. Look at the big picture. Understand what it is. Don't hate it just because it doesn't fit in with your taste of how government should be run, or you think government should be nicer than that and play a role in the economy, etc. No. Understand that it's not the bad side or an incompetent side of economics, right? Pushed by otherwise sincere people. No, it's a looting operation, and it's
Right.
part of a global looting operation. And what I was going to say is...
Of the British Empire.
Of the British Empire. Well, the Anna Bligh situation in Queensland, the
Right.
Queensland government situation, is part of exactly the same looting that is being done in Brazil at the moment by the same crowd, and for the same reason. That's the important point.
Well, one of Rothschild's advisors is within the one of Rothschild. This guy Trevor, he represents Rothschild, and he's an advisor for Anna Bligh.
Well, Trevor Rowe is his name. Mm-hmm. He's the current chairman of Rothschild Australia. Mm-hmm. He's been the chairman since 2005. He is the Queensland government's favourite big business consultant, if you will, right? They put him in all kinds of important jobs. He gets the job done, exactly. That kind of... So he's until recently, he's been the chairman of the Queensland Investment Corporation, which takes the superannuation funds of Queensland state government employees and invests them.
You know, I understand he sleeps around a bit with both Labor and Liberal. Both.
Well, he's good.
Another Liberal party.
He's described as very good friends. He moved to Queensland because of his very good friends of Peter Cheshire Cat Grin Beattie, and he was before that. He was John Howard's favourite go-to guy when John Howard was selling assets he advised Howard personally on a lot of the sales of assets at a federal level in the 1990s, right? So yeah, no, he's all things to all men when it comes to that. But in reality, it's not that that he serves both sides equally. It's both sides serve him equally, really, because of who he represents, right? So it's his bank, Rothschild Australia, that's running Bligh's privatisation program, right? They've already sold the electricity retail system up there, and now there's a smorgasbord of assets to sell, including the ports and the rail and forestry and all kinds of things. And his bank is one of the three lead advisors for those sales as well. The other two lead advisors are Merrill Lynch and the Royal Bank of Scotland. Mm-hmm. So of those three, two of them are into Alpha Banks, Rothschild and Royal Bank of Scotland, right? And so they are ploughing ahead with this, and therefore it's not just Anna Bligh's narcissistic personality that's making it happen. She's convenient. That's convenient for the people who are definitely doing this, because for the last 18 months, it's this type of operation that's the only thing that's been propping up the world financial system. Yeah. Right?
So that's their solution.
That's their solution. Well, Brazil is the big cash cow for them at the moment.
Right.
You know,
they're extracting 20% interest returns on their investments in Brazil right now. I've heard
20%
similar figures, and the point is that that's just impossible. There's nothing on this planet or in this solar system that I'm aware of where you can make honest and sustainable returns on that type of investment of 20%. The only way you can do that is if you're looting the physical real economy. You're looting,
which really the looting of the economy is to try and save the British Empire, which is actually bankrupt.
Well,
so it's kind of like they're trying to save their ass, but they're not being able to.
It's both a monetarist solution.
Bankrupt.
So they think it's a solution because it's monetarist. It's generating money.
Right.
Right. That's money that can flow back into these European banks and make them look good. Right. But it's criminal at the same time, mm-hmm. and both only exist under globalisation. Both sides of the same operation can only exist under globalisation, which took away all the rules, etc. And it is being done. They are generating 20% returns, and it's coming out of the hides of the Brazilian people, right? What Australians need to understand is this is just as surely coming out of our hides as well. Mm-hmm. You know, we're sort of...
And there's reading material people can read up on if they want more to look into.
They can. I definitely heartily urge them to read that. And for...
The EIR?
For the EIR. And these two publications... Stop the British Crown Plot to Crush Australia's Unions. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the best pieces of research we ever did in our own New Citizen newspaper. Defeat the Cynic, Fight for a National Bank has a very exceptional historical publication in there, which was all our own work into the way banks in Australia ran fascist organisations here in the 30s. Right. But towards the end of that, there's a summary of this kind of privatisation spree that went on.
So people actually need to do some reading and get into how it is that the British Empire are actually looting the country of Australia.
They do.
and what we can do to solve the problem, because there's many solutions in these papers.
Yeah, just to conclude and wrap things up here, would you take a few minutes to explain what Lyndon LaRouche has prescribed as a actual cure for this problem, like how we can, what the actual recovery and the solutions are to this inter-alpha group?
Well, the recovery is, the only solution is get sovereign nation states to assert themselves over this again. Because this, at its heart, this is a private financial power that dictates to nation states, it is the British Empire, because it's the British system, right? It's been the British system for, 300 and a bit years to do this, since they set up the Bank of England in 1694, a private central bank to run the country, right? To control the financial affairs of the country, which old Labour used to call the money power. So when you have that set up, no nation has sovereignty, right? So to defeat it, nations have to assert their sovereignty. And we've given, LaRouche has proposed specifics of what to do. First and foremost, he's called on the world's 4 leading nation states: United States, Russia, China and India.
Right.
Get them together. The reason LaRouche has said that is he said it's not that he wants all countries involved in this, but those 4 uniquely have the bulk and the might to defeat the British Empire, in the sense that the reactions that will come out of the City of London against these nation states doing this will be so enormous, the financial counterattack will be so enormous, that only those 4 will be able to withstand it. But once they do, and once they especially scrap all the arrangements that underpin globalisation and go back to establishing a new world financial arrangement based on a credit system, based on the powers in the US Constitution.
Which would also include the best parts of the original Bretton Woods, like fixed exchange rates.
They're the basic regulations of Bretton Woods, right? Where you fix the exchange rates, so you have stability in the system, you have capital control, so the government can tell, you can invest or you can't invest in here, those types of arrangements. You use tariffs, right, where each nation has the right to use tariffs without retaliation, so that they can foster the industries they need that are strategic to them, right? Like every nation should have its own food security, that type of thing, right? And if you need tariffs for that. So those basic arrangements, but also base it on a credit system, which is unique to the US Constitution and but also the Australian Constitution, where the government can be the ultimate owners and controllers of the banking system, right? Not all the banks, but the heart of the banking system, to have national banks instead of central banks, and they can put credit out in these areas. If they establish that, most countries in the world would flock to join it, right? And then that's the first major step. And the 2 other things that LaRouche has called for is national banking, right, which is a subsidiary, as we talked about, but also the Homeowners and Bank Protection Act in America, or the Homeowners and Bank Protection Bill here. That type of bill, which is an emergency piece of legislation, would be the first step to immediately putting a leash, if you will, on these predator banks, right, like Rothschild into Alpha Group, while a whole reorganisation is done of the system, biased towards what's in the interest of the people, not in the interest of the banks, right? That's LaRouche's solution, and they hate him for it. Because it'll work.
Well, exactly, it would work. And this is why we need people to actually join and understand these ideas and help us implement these ideas also. So you can help out in many ways. You can finance what we're doing as an organisation. We need the money. We're a self-funded organisation. Get some literature, understand what's going on, and join us. That's what we need you to do. Today is April the 6th. It's Tuesday, and thank you very much, Robbie. That was very useful.
Kat,
and I'm Catherine, and this is Glenn, and we're signing off.